Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Caroline Sinders. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm an artist and designer who studies machine learning, online communities, communication, and technology's impacts in society. For nearly the past 7 years, I've been studying abusive language, harassment, politics, social networks, and AI. I've worked with clients like Facebook, Intel, the Wikimedia Foundation, Bandcamp, and others. As an artist, my work has been shown at the Tate Modern State Exchange, Victoria and Albert Museum, Museum of Modern Art Bologna, as well as others. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what we do, how we speak and talk, and how that can be translated into data. And I was thinking about this even before COVID, of what is the digitization of our communities and interactions. For example, I have an art project called Feminist Dataset. Feminist Dataset applies feminist theory and frameworks to investigate technology and AI. And during COVID, I started transitioning my workshops into being online. So someone who believes in intersectionality and someone who studies online harassment, but as a millennial, the shift to the purely digital is something I greet innately. I'm young, internet savvy, but I still approach this with trepidation, especially because in March 2019, as COVID shutdown spread to Europe, where I'm generally based, to the United States, where I'm from, this led to nearly every facet of life shifting to the purely digital. So with some funding from the Mozilla Foundation and Omidyar Network, I conducted research from March to June on how communities are responding to this right now. What kinds of events are they holding, and how are digital tools failing them? And what kinds of new design do we need to respond to this moment? I made a toolkit and website full of findings and best practices, which I think Republica may tweet out later. What I find fascinating is the discourse that was happening around COVID, which was talking about how scary and uncertain things were during COVID-19, which is incredibly true. We are facing a kind of catastrophic horror we have never seen before. And it's okay to be unsure. It's okay to be figuring things out. But the world has always been an uncertain place, and people respond to it in resounding and resilient style ways. I hate to glean over the sadness that has come up out of COVID, but I want to highlight some of the things I found really inspirational. And there was some beauty for me during these moments of COVID-19, which were in joining communities and staying in contact. Life moves on and we adapt, and our social lives, which feed our emotional lives, are incredibly important, which led me to asking this question: how are we creating beauty and avoiding harm online, and what does it look like, especially right now? I believe that digital interfaces are the bridges to our community, and I just want to check and see if the slides have been integrated into the presentation. Maybe not. Okay, great. So I've been thinking about what a community needs, and then in particular, I've been turning back to this sort of metaphor that I've been working with called digital interfaces are the bridges to our community. So technology can't fix systemic inequality revealed by COVID-19, but it can help make connections with our communities better. For example, I present to you remotely, and some of you may be there in person, but a lot of you are watching online. The interface of this video conference is the tool, right? And that's the bridge. But some of these tools are failing and not serving communities well. They weren't designed for this kind of new use where everyone is on them all the time. Some video conferencing tools, for example, are so narrowly constrained, just designed for businesses. So as designers and engineers and community members, we need to create better and more responsible tools so communities can have safety, intimacy, and even delight. Which leads me to asking, what does a community need? Or perhaps, what does a community need? A community needs safety, intimacy, and support with tools that can be customized or that allow for more agency to create different kinds of spaces and needs. The next few descriptions will be me describing examples of art shows, lectures, dance parties that have all been happening online. To get to where we are right now, in this meeting, in this presentation, it took care and planning and consideration. To get to where we are right now, we have to be really mindful to avoid new and emerging forms of harassment that are occurring in our new normal, such as Zoom bombing. So what is that? It's It's a brand new kind of harassment that has popped up during COVID-19. It's when people take control of a Zoom meeting by turning on their audio and saying harassing things like racial slurs, misogynistic threats, etc. People can also take control of the video and expose themselves or show harmful content. So a way to combat this is by having a moderator really be in control of the Zoom meeting or room and remove the ability for anyone to speak or show videos who are attending. But this requires care, planning, and consideration prior to starting the talk. One thing I want to remind people is that technology has always been unequal. We're just seeing it a lot more clearly now. Our tools have always been imperfect, but we are seeing the cracks now more than ever before with things like Zoom bombing or people of color being disproportionately affected by facial recognition surveillance and even more affected by COVID-19. Or for example, with Zoom announcing it wouldn't use end-to-end encryption on free accounts to better partner with police departments, and then a few weeks later, due to public outrage, deciding to give everyone free end-to-end encryption. But I still ask, what does a community need? Even with Zoom bombing, some of the solutions to mitigate it cut down on intimacy building. So what can we do to build intimacy and safety? For example, all of you seeing this or being able to interact with me. So for all of you seeing this, what would be a more engaging interaction would be for me to see you and for there to be some kind of chat, but that can be less safe. So what we end up having is this lecture, which will then have a moderated Q&A, which is a way to bridge and bring the intimacy back in. So again, asking, what does a community need? What does the community need to engage together online? Let's look at some examples of communities that are out there adapting in the wild to COVID-19. So a really great example is Bedside Strong. Mutual aid groups are volunteer groups that provide groceries, supplies, and support during a time of crisis. This community building effort is able to grow quickly and successfully because the participants are already community builders who are already involved in their community. So it was a focus on the community and not the individual that allowed for things like NYC PPE. It's a group that distributes PPE masks to doctors in the United States, and a group like Bedside Strong to come online. These community ties existed, albeit less in official forms, before COVID-19, meaning the community members were already there, but they weren't, they didn't have a specific title with an organization in the community, but they were like neighbors. The technology sprung up around the communities as people went into action helping each other. These groups are using multiple tools that I call digitally duct taping. So they digitally duct tape the tools together so it can function, working with thousands of data points and many volunteers. Digital duct taping will be, for example, using something like Airtable to create a database, and then using Slack to coordinate all the members, which can be thousands of volunteers, and then using WhatsApp for core members, and then holding talks over Zoom where they then field questions in a Google Doc with a moderator. So they're using all of these different tools together to create a variety of cohesive experiences. Bedside Strong is a digital group that sprung up in the neighborhood of neighbors during COVID-19 with all different kinds of support. So like grocery delivery. The group has flyers all over the neighborhood with instructions on how to join the Bedside Strong Slack channel to coordinate delivery and create spaces of community during COVID-19 and organize volunteers. So all this is done by seeing a physical piece of paper, and then they join the Slack channel. They use Slack, Google Voice, and Airtable to help organize deliveries. Samantha Garfield, a volunteer with Bedside Strong, gives an example of how the group tries to meet and organize across their nearly 3,000 members. She said in an interview to me, "The other day we posted an all-hands meeting where we were looking to get a broad-based buy-in on a set of guiding principles for our mutual aid group. And we were struggling with how we can do that effectively because there might be hundreds of people on the call. And the goal is not just to ask them to thumbs up or thumbs down on the call, but generally invite all kinds of questions, different kinds of engagement. So we had a conversation going where we would ask people to do what's called stack in a Zoom chat, where they say stack to raise their hands. And B, ask them to weigh in on a straw poll on Slido. And then C, concurrently posting a Q&A on Slido and having people upvote or downvote questions. So there were all these different levels of how people could voice their dissent based on how extreme the dissent was. Groups need to think about when in taking information, what to do with it and why. What's the point of their group and where are the solutions? Bedside Strong, for example, exists just for Bedside, not for all of Brooklyn. They follow their defined missions. What they accomplish is monumental, and they accomplish it with dedication, organization, but a specific focus fulfilling the missions of their group. They don't really deviate from that. Another example I want to give is Present, which is actually presented from Berlin, Germany. In March, I spoke to graphic designer, educator, lecturer, and artist Prem Krishnamurthy about his performance lecture series called Present. Present started by happenstance. Prem had planned on an exhibition called Polymorph in the University of Connecticut at the end of March, and would be accompanied by a performance lecture essay that he had written that would then become distributed as a PDF publication. In mid-March, the show was postponed, and Prem quickly shifted gears because he knew he would still like to do the event and performance lecture series. And then he decided to create Present to do his performance lecture and invite the artists, curators, and lecturers from the show that had been canceled to do cameos. What had meant to be a solo performance lecture became a much more inclusive format where the artists could be given a space from the show. What was meant to be a one-time thing actually turned into many days that happened for about 6 to 8 weeks. So Prem had thought, if this is one thing, so people had encouraged him to keep going during COVID. And he thought, if people are responding to this sort of sense of connectedness, and this is what I can offer, then let's do it. He highlights that a variation of tempo and rhythm is important because time on Zoom can feel twice as long. He says he normally does this when teaching by showing video, a talk, and asking Q&A, but all in different formats and lengths. At the very end of Present, for example, after showing a film, they have a listening experience, a lecture, a Q&A, and then they always end the session in group karaoke. Prem suggests you have to rethink how you do things, how you present ideas, and give them shape. Prem learned to work with Zoom in a way and edit film in a particular way, and has a documentation of the show in Google Slides, and is trying to activate parts of the brain and learn every week from the show. On the other level of it, Prem is starting to understand the questions of scale and community in a different way. The cap isn't who can physically fit in a room. It's a different kind of cap when you're in a digital space. Prem hasn't limited the number of participants yet, but there seems to be a natural scale that seems to shape what might occur and the different kinds of interactions in it. He would consider adding a cap if harassment starts to happen. So the other thing that's interesting about Zoom is the way in which it highlights the impossibility of not having a singular viewpoint. So when Prem records from Zoom, he receives a particular version, but he doesn't know what the audience sees, like who is at the top of their screen or who is digitally sitting next to them. So there's all these different kinds of viewpoints that participants are bringing. Another example of what I attended during this research time was a multi-100-person lecture series where the attendees would engage in the comments and the moderators were the authors, Laura Killen and Catherine D'Ignazio of Data Feminism. These authors held a multi-week lecture series in response to their book, Data Feminism. The moderators and authors have control. It's much more similar to a structured lecture we'd have offline. But the content was so amazing. And what I enjoyed about this being in Berlin is that this kind of open lecture series online never would have happened prior to COVID-19. It would have been in a physical room in Boston where the authors are located. This actually, COVID and switching to online for the lecture series actually allowed for a much more diverse audience. And the audience attended from across the globe, from across the EU, India, Malaysia, the US, etc. Sometimes a shift to online actually can create more equity in terms of who can attend and how, and creates a much more diverse audience. I hope post-COVID-19, we can still create these digital spaces and opportunities. I'm just going to highlight a few more examples. One other example is Now Play This, a games and interactive arts festival held in London's Somerset House. During COVID, it was canceled and then reinstated to be digital. Marie Fulston, the creator of the festival and a former curator of games at the Victoria and Albert Museum, has been thinking about what it means to have curation and exhibition design in a digital space and what design means inside of that space. She built a few different art exhibits in Animal Crossing to sort of play with this idea of the digital design and then push part of that into Now Play This. Marie was assessing, as a curator who traditionally works with the digital, but would bring the digital into the physical space, what is possible now with exhibition. If we can't be in the same room, touching the same things, how do we translate the physical into the virtual, especially with a festival? This wasn't about making an exhibition physical. The digital already manifests physically, but it's thinking about the rituals, resonances, and constraints that happen inside of a festival or an exhibition. To go to a festival, you get into a car, then you go into a physical space where only so many bodies can fit there. It's a form of intimacy, but you change perhaps in how you act in that space versus how you act in your own living room or backyard. So can these rituals be brought into a digital space, which brings us to Animal Crossing? Historically, virtual exhibitions online and in virtual life like Second Life have happened before. So this isn't new, but we're seeing the creators, for Now Play This, they hosted a panel with the creators of Untitled Goose Game, presenting in Animal Crossing to try to replicate these feelings of ritual and exhibition. A lot of things online can feel like the most broadcast version of itself. It's a one-to-many, but Marie really wanted intimacy. Animal Crossing isn't a broadcast channel. It allows users to engage in a specific ritualized way. They have to visit the specific island in Animal Crossing. The embodiment of space is different for users than what's happening in Zoom. The juxtaposition of that space also looks a certain way. It's twee and cute and personalized per person, and so it touches on intimacy. Everyone in Animal Crossing made their character a certain way. Rituals don't translate 100%, but that is okay. Now Play This also curated virtual field trips with Robert Yang, a games professor and artist, who took people on a field trip into Half-Life 1. The idea was to go just beyond the talk. There's multiplayer games where people can go see the game itself and walk around. It's viewed as a guided experience. For the field trip, participants have to book a ticket prior, show up at a certain time, and then you have to go in the game and you have to focus and follow the guide. The field trips are capped at a certain size so the artist can really engage with participants can follow along. Now Play This also curated another field trip in No Man's Sky. So an artist took people on a planet in No Man's Sky and explained what is landscape photography. The 10 participants on this field trip were then given photographic assignments and asked to come back and show what they had photographed inside of this video game. And they were just screen capturing as their photographs. Both of these events had different levels of engagement. And both of these field trips were also live streamed on Twitch so people could watch in a more broadcast style. However, the point of the field trip was to create these more intimate experiences. And I love this example because it can show a morphing or reconfiguring of video games and of us using something and its unintended way to yield delightful results. Now we're going into takeaways. So what does a community need? It needs intimacy, safety, and support. I created a checklist for the project that's on the website currently. What I learned from interviewing almost 30 people across the EU and the US is that people need consistent ways to share media across video platforms. We can look to Slack, which has the ability to drag and drop across any part of the tool interface. On Zoom, however, you can only drag to share content in a tiny, wee little window where the chat is. You can't even share media on Google Hangouts. People need more intimate ways to have conversations. So on Zoom, we see this with the ability to have breakout rooms. So the ability to pair off and create smaller areas of engagement is really important. What's also important is customization. Many creators, school educators, and event planners mentioned wanting a dashboard to better import audio, to line up speakers. What they really needed is a broadcasting tool inside of something like video conferencing, like Google Hangouts or Zoom. So people want consistent ways to share media. A conferencing tool is much like a social network combined with a TV station, and then the most conversational space someone can be in. And the tool has to reflect all of those changing or very different user needs. And here's what people are doing when they think the best tools fail. So part of this project was capturing what I call the human element, or what are the human ways or the human workflows that a tool can't do. And that's something like digital duct taping. So someone deciding that we're going to use Google Docs for this one thing, we're going to use Slack as well, and then we're also going to use Airtable and this thing, and then deciding what tool is used when. That's the human element, and that is digital duct taping. Some schools, for example, are using Zoom, email, Google Docs, Slack, GitHub, and Arena for assignments and knowledge sharing, and even for talks and lectures. One tool isn't sufficient enough, but integration across them could be helpful. Another thing is what is called the run of show, which is a plan. So time in Zoom feels much longer, but even with better tools, a host needs a plan, knowing who is speaking when, prepared questions. And from this run of show, attendees need guidance. So many users mentioned being thrown into breakout rooms, but were given no clarity or warning. So telling your attendees in the beginning what is going on, what is the plan. A side note, a tool or interface can help with that, such as showing breakout rooms time, but a host still needs to outline what is going on. And lastly, you can have tangible rituals. That can be asking attendees to hold up a paper sign or having everyone engage in a breathing exercises. Sometimes the most intimate act online isn't the UI we put into the tool, but the exercises we can do together. And just remember, lastly, this isn't a one-to-one to offline, and no tool can reflect that. But what we can make that is different, and it can still be important. We have to reconfigure our expectations and remember that, and just remember this one question of how can we yield to intimacy? How can we design for intimacy together? A lot of that is resetting our expectations, having a plan for online harassment, and having a structure and plan for attendees. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caroline. I have the first question already, which goes right after your talk. Could you define intimacy on the internet, please?
Sure. I mean, so intimacy doesn't have necessarily one kind of definition. So we can have intimacy in a large public space, which could be having like a planned area to engage in. I think intimacy is thinking through expectations and design. So I think we traditionally think of intimacy as a small group where we're sharing personal details or things that we care about. But intimacy in that way can also be sort of transposed into this larger space. So I think that there's varying levels of intimacy in the way that we have varying levels of privacy, right? Mm-hmm. Not everything is public or private, but we can have a variety of like semi-private. For example, if someone were to give a talk in a room with 100 people, but it's not live streamed, and maybe they're talking about a very important subject, right? Mm-hmm. That can be a form of intimacy even with 100 people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. The next question is also the elephant in the room. Have you found good ways to include elderly people within what you call digital duct taping? Have you found any nice projects on that?
So Bedside Strong delivers a lot of groceries to their elderly neighbors. And so that's why they have this physical printed flyer that actually has instructions on how to join Slack and what is Slack. And then inside of Slack, they have a bunch of volunteers ready to answer questions, mm-hmm. to respond to people. And then they're very mindful on if they're holding a Zoom call, for example. And one of the reasons they picked Zoom is that was being used by doctors in the US. So elderly patients are already using Zoom, that the instructions were clear, mm-hmm. and that there was always a point person.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is from our YouTube audience, Shoru Maya. Love the approach on encounters in video games that weren't thought of by the designers. How open do you think are video game companies readers, or do dead artists get supported by the creators in any way?
Let me maybe repeat that back. So are they asking how often do the creators of video games interact with the artists who are coming up with new versions of the video games?
Or maybe how supportive are the game companies on approaches that are reusing the software?
I'm not sure how supportive the software companies or video games companies are, but inside of indie games, there is this movement towards modding video games, and video games get modded, which means they get changed all the time by creators. There is this history of doing that, but in the indie games world, there is also this sort of subset of being able to use and change and shift video games. For example, there's a version of Doom where there are hearts that you're interacting with, and the whole video game is modded to be pink and red, and it's very different from the way we traditionally think of Doom, sorry.
Fitting. The next question is from Agnes. Do you have tips for safe online experiences for users living in countries that don't always have freedom of speech?
Yes. So on the website, please check it out. It's responsibletech.design. We have a bunch of tips on harassment and security, but I would also really suggest looking at things like Mozilla has a guide called Privacy by Design, and they made one specifically for video conferencing tools. And so they walk through and rate the security of all these different popular tools. Generally, I would say if you're worried about your security, are you worried more about information sort of like leaking out of the tool itself? So worried that someone could access your Zoom chats if you've been chatting on Zoom, or are you more worried about someone attending? So I think it's important to think about it in those different ways. If you're worried about people attending a private talk you're holding, the write-up I made also gets into that, of how you can create different ways to sort of cut down on harassment. So some of that can be having not a public URL, but maybe creating an event sign up that someone has to go through and send in their details, and then you decide if they can attend or not. And then right before the event, you send out a URL with a password, but you're never tweeting or sharing any of that public information. If people want to attend, they have to sign up through a sign-up form like Eventbrite or Meetup or even a Google form.
Yeah, thanks a lot. The last question is from Jule again. In your opinion, what does social distancing do with us?
I mean, I think social distancing is healthy for COVID, but one thing that came up again and again in my research starting in March was really actually how important our social interactions are and how important it is to a community to be able to engage with each other. Our social interactions, like our friendships, our casual acquaintances, build a form of resiliency. And we need that resiliency for our emotions, for us to be okay. And part of what I think was really hard about COVID for people was the fact that they felt really alone. And so these sort of shifts to digital, to have communities holding video conferencing calls or, Zoom happy hours, or there were a lot of online dance parties that I saw. Or like, for example, United We Stream, being able to maybe sit with your friends in different places and watch a DJ. You need those things. You need social time. You need to be with other people. So you can socially distance while being with other people. But I do think it's important to do that. If that is a video conference call, or if that's sitting 1.5 meters or 2 meters apart, in the park, you should be doing those things. But you have to be safe.
There's another question that just came in. What do you think will remain of all these digital initiatives after Corona? Or is there after Corona, maybe?
That's such a good question, because I think about that all the time. I think we just don't know. The last time that there was some really big monumental sort of flu or virus that sort of took over the world was in the early 1900s, right? That was like what was called in the US, the Spanish influenza, probably called something different and less racist here. But you know, that was one of the last times that there was this really high rate, right, of a virus, and people were wearing face masks. And that was in the 19 teens. And so they obviously didn't have Zoom or Facebook. But I don't think we know. And I think what's probably important to recognize is different countries will be responding in different ways, which may affect our global community. So in a sense of in Berlin, it looks very different for us to go out right now than it does for a lot of people in the United States, right? Or for a lot of people in like different countries. And so what may be normal for us may not be really normal for other countries. And that is like that kind of difference of the ability to not be able to publicly gather will really determine, you know, what communities look like. So I guess the short answer is we don't know. I do imagine that we'll be having these hybrid events and these digital talks for at least like 2 more years, or until a vaccine can at least be given to everyone, right? And I think the experiences we have in one country may be radically different than the experiences that communities have in another country.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for those inspiring words. Caroline Sinders.
Thank you so much for having me.